作为五眼联盟之一的新西兰，近来在华为问题上似乎不得不做出回应。19日，新西兰总理阿德恩在接受媒体采访时提到，在新西兰 5G 网络的建设上，还没有对是否要采用华为的设备做出最后的决定。他还提到，采用华为设备的新西兰电信公司 Spark 需要减轻安全忧患。在阿德恩表态的前一天，英国金融时报爆出消息称英国政府认为华为的安全风险在可控范围之内，但是同为五眼联盟国其他盟友的态度则大不相同，最显然的就是美国和澳大利亚。美国不仅是在上个月经过司法部正式对华为提出起诉，还通过不同的政客在欧洲进行游说，试图劝说各国不要使用华为设备。澳大利亚自上一年起也禁止了华为参与本国 5G 建设。但是五眼联盟国家的关系似乎越发复杂，还出现了裂痕。澳大利亚金融评论网用惊喜来形容英国对华为安全风险做出的声明。加拿大环球新闻网则在19日评论到，英国的表态给予了加拿大喘息的空间。非五眼联盟国家也先后做出表态。德国基尔新闻报20日发表评论称， 5G 建设问题事关重大安全利益，不应当由德国政府拍板。评论员还称，华为甚至有能力让德国通讯网络瘫痪，因此这样的决定应该由德国联邦议会做出决策，绝对不可以让德国政府单独做出决定。而就在20日，新西兰先驱报发出的最新报道称，总理阿德恩证实，经济发展部部长将会在4月出席一带一路峰会，还可能会率领贸易代表团去中国。在五眼联盟的复杂对峙中，新西兰为何会做出这样的决定呢？总理阿德恩对华为和 5G 的措辞是否暗示着新西兰和中国更深一层的复杂关系呢？惠灵顿维多利亚大学的战略研究教授 Robert Ayson 罗伯特艾森与我们进行了连线。
Professor Ayson, today I want to talk a little bit about Huawei and its presence in New Zealand.
在我们的对话中，艾森教授提到，新西兰当局对中国在本国进行电信网络建设本来没有任何担忧，但是直到去年，政府以国家安全为由，反对了本土通讯商 Spark 关于使用华为 5G 网络的建设方案，这是华为 5G 第一次进入公众讨论。但是因为新西兰政府通讯安全局还在对其进行调查，这样的争议暂时得到了平息。但是新西兰和中国的关系紧张点主要集中在新西兰对中国南海的立场。艾森教授还说，其实在国际社会上，不仅仅是五眼联盟国家，其他国家对华为 5G 的立场各不相同。尽管我们有美国和澳大利亚领先的禁用华为的强硬政策，许多国家，比方说加拿大，还在观望。美国和澳大利亚当然希望新西兰采取同样的政策，但是总理似乎还没有下定论的准备。华为的 5G 在新西兰的未来还值得观望。艾森教授还提到，中国跟新西兰的关系一直来看都是围绕着经济利益和效率展开的，从旅游业到商品贸易。而如今华为的问题逼迫新西兰做出一个单选题，到底是要以国家安全优先还是经济利益优先呢？如果新西兰要禁用华为，它还需要考虑此举给其他想要进驻的技术公司发出了一个怎样的信号。他还要衡量自己国家的经济是否能承担得起以优先国家安全考虑所带来的经济后果。
Today I want to talk a little bit about Huawei and its presence in New Zealand. I'm sure you've read a lot of news this past few weeks about the New Zealand-China relationship and how it's related to Huawei's presence in New Zealand. So I wonder, could you explain to our audience who are not too familiar with how Huawei is developing in New Zealand, what kind of a presence does Huawei have in your country? Or in other words, how important is Huawei in New Zealand?
Well, I mean, I'm not a telecommunications expert, so there are limits to how much I know about the actual presence of Huawei. I think Huawei is in the news because of for two reasons. One is the international stories about countries pushing back on Huawei and indicating that they're not willing to necessarily accept Huawei as part of their 5G infrastructure, and that's particularly some of New Zealand's traditional partners, such as the United States and Australia, but there are also some others as well. And the second thing in New Zealand is Huawei has had a presence in telecommunications. It's been involved in earlier versions of internet infrastructure. But telecommunications infrastructure, but the 5G, while there has been a small debate in the past about New Zealand government's acceptance of Huawei as part of that infrastructure, there were more concerns expressed in Australia and in the United States, and up until last year, my understanding is that the New Zealand government had not indicated particular concerns in public about Huawei, but last year, when bids for the 5G infrastructure were being put together, the New Zealand government told one of New Zealand's main telecommunications companies, that's Spark, that it did not feel that its bid, its proposal, if that and the indication is if that included Huawei, quite met the requirements of legislation. And so that's the first time we've really had a sense of pushback in New Zealand on Huawei. Up until then, I think it's been fairly uncontroversial. It's not been a major debate. And up until then, up until the news of that response on the bid involving Huawei, the New Zealand-China relationship, if there have been difficulties, it's been more in terms of things like New Zealand's position on the South China Sea, which has become more, I think, stronger in the last 3 or 4 years. So that's really where some of the so the Huawei thing is, in terms of an issue of real public debate in New Zealand, it's only in the last few months that has been the case.
Right. I'm not sure if you've read about a Financial Times report that came out earlier this week that said UK is quote unquote mitigating threats of Huawei.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, what do you think of New Zealand's response to UK's decision, and do you think it's in consistency with what the Prime Minister has expressed about Huawei?
Right. Well, I think one of the ways that New Zealand's approach to Huawei and to working with China is sometimes analysed is to compare what New Zealand is doing with its traditional security partners, including partners that are part of the Five Eyes network. And we know that two members of that network, the United States and Australia, have said no to Huawei on this sort of development. But we also have, it's also been indicated in the last few days, as you say, that the United Kingdom has said that they believe that they can mitigate the risks that are there. Now, it's not easy for New Zealanders to understand quite what those risks are. We're still trying to work out quite what those in the public discussion. And I think because most of us, including me, are not technologically very sophisticated, it's a little bit of a challenge. But we also find that the fifth member of that group, Canada, is still working out its approach. So I think the first thing you can say is that at the moment there is not a consistent single consensus approach amongst all of those traditional partners, and some of the European countries, I think, are going to probably indicate reluctance to work with Huawei, but some of them may say yes. Some of our Asia Pacific partners are not so sure. Some seem to be okay. So there are obviously some different opinions there. My understanding is that New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has said in the last day or so that New Zealand will make its own decision about this, that its decision on how to respond or how to look at Huawei's potential involvement in 5G will be done on a national basis. And she referred back to that legislation, the national legislation that is used to assess whether a bid is okay for national purposes. Now, that's and I think that's an important point, that New Zealand wants to make this this approach independently. But it's very clear that quite a few of New Zealand's traditional partners, or at least two of the most important ones, Australia and the US, would be very interested in making sure that their close partners took a similar view. And so in that sense, I think it's hard to escape the broader context for this is that the United States in particular, and also I think Australia, would like to see other partners take a very cautious view on Huawei. But I do think it's really interesting for New Zealand that now there isn't it's clear now that whichever decision New Zealand takes on Huawei, and the Prime Minister has also indicated that the decision on Huawei is not a final one, in the sense that it's possible for the New Zealand telecommunications company to come back with a revised bid, and that might include Huawei, and if that meets the requirements of the legislation, it might still be okay, but we just don't know yet. So there's quite a bit to run still on this story.
I understand that Huawei has been banned. Its 5G development has been banned in New Zealand. Do you think that has made any difference to how 5G has worked or will work in New Zealand?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I'm not sure if it's quite a ban yet. I think it's more that Huawei's involvement in this initial proposal has been pushed back. So it's possible that Huawei may play a role, but it's understandable why people would say that Huawei has been rejected or banned. But what's interesting here is the I think the competition between two goals. One goal is obviously national security, and the ability of New Zealand organisations based in New Zealand to work with telecommunications infrastructure that is not going to be used for political purposes, that sort of thing. That's the first thing. But the other thing is the interest in having a top flight telecommunications infrastructure that provides efficiency, that has access to world leading technology, that is the best you can get. Now, if you start saying no to certain telecommunications providers, and we know that Huawei is a very big provider internationally, are you exchanging economic efficiency for national security? How do you draw that line? What's the important? What is the important? What comes first? Efficiency or security? And at the moment, I think what's happened is that in the New Zealand's approach to China, it used to always be about efficiency, China as an economic market, China as an opportunity. The good news about China as a rising economic power, and terms of concerns about security, whether it's South China Sea, whether it's in cyber, whether it's what Huawei may or may not be doing. So that's changing the context for the discussion. But there is a trade-off. The more you focus on the national security element, the more that you run the chances that there may be economic repercussions that may not be positive for your private sector. The more you focus on the private sector and their interests, the less you may have a chance to think about put your security concerns first. So that's a trade-off that is changing. And I think for New Zealand, given that we've tended to see China in the past as a market, that's an interesting change in the philosophy on the way that the China debate has moved in New Zealand.
That's a fascinating point. And talking about the relationship between New Zealand and China, could you go back a bit and tell us how has this relationship been from a historical perspective? So, for example, has it always been kind of close, or do you see there's a trend?
这是我们关于华为在新西兰的对话上集。在下集中，艾森教授还给我们分析了近来几件比较大的新闻事件，比方说中国新西兰旅游联的取消和飞向上海的新西兰航线突然掉头一事。我们还聊到了历史上中国和新西兰关系的几个关键点，当然少不了的南海政策。请持续关注我们即将推出的连线下集。